Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. A huge thank you to you, Ruth Badley. Thank you for taking the time to join our Memoir Mentors for our first Q&A session. A quick introduction about Memoir Mentors, if you don't mind. Memoir Mentors is a community that was formed very recently with the intent to support, motivate, and inspire memoirists and take our writing to the next level. We meet every Thursday for writing sessions, challenge-based workshops, and a book club. The very first book we chose was none other than the book Where Are the Grown-Ups by Ruth Badley. A few words about Ruth. Ruth graduated from the Central School of Speech and Drama and taught in secondary schools in London before moving to South Australia, where she worked in adult migrant education, specifically with Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees. She went on to enjoy a second career as a journalist, as well as writing and directing the play titled Just Playing for Dubai's Short and Sweet Theatre Festival in 2016. In 2019, she published her first book with the memoir titled Where Are the Grown-Ups? So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Ruth to give us an overview of her book, and after that, I think we'll dive into our Q&A, our questions, which were generated by the book club. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you, Christina. And thanks for joining me from Germany and America. I'm sitting here in rural Essex in the UK, talking to you here through the magic of technology. So without further ado, Where Are the Grown-Ups? It's my first book, and in shorthand terms, I would describe it as a multi-generational family memoir. So really it's about me, my mother Sylvia, and my grandmother Rose, who is the heart and soul of the story. She's the grandmother I didn't know, and the book really reflects on the impact of her death at the age of 25. And some parts of the book are written as my own lived experience, and other parts rely on historical research and information gleaned from historical documents, archives, and journals. Now, Christina has sent me a list of questions that I believe you generated, and they were really interesting to me, and I've made some extensive notes on each of them. So I will just go through the questions and my answers, if that's okay with Christina.
Sure.
Anyone else has anything additional that they want to ask at the end, that's fine by me. Would that format work for you, Christina?
Sure. If you don't mind, could I'll start with our first question.
Sure.
We were really curious. We really enjoyed reading your book, really got a good chance to learn about you and your family, and really enjoyed that process. We were wondering if there was a catalyst that moved you to write this story.
Well, there were a couple of things really, and they all came together at the same time. I started writing The Grown-Ups in 2015, but I didn't yet know if I had a story that would make a book when I started writing, because the writing started as a response to grief. I was living overseas at the time when I got the call that no expat wants to receive, which is the one that tells you that your closest relative has been taken seriously ill. So I immediately took a plane home and back to the UK to be with my mum at her bedside. She'd had a stroke. I was with her for the week preceding her death and at the moment of her death. And when I returned to Dubai, I found writing was a helpful way to really process the experience and what I'd gone through. Now, that really isn't terribly interesting, is it, as a premise to start the book? But the key thing is about me and my mum is that we didn't have a very good relationship at all. For many of my formative years, it felt unsatisfactory for both of us. Yet, when she was in hospital and unable to speak in conventional ways, something passed between us that seemed significant. And it was something that prompted me to try and unravel what had gone wrong. So that's really where the writing started. And a few months after her death, and I'm sure many of you can identify with this, you have to do the thing that close relatives always have to do, and it's the worst thing in the world, which is to clear your relative's house of their possessions after they've died. And it was then that I really found some photographs among her personal effects that I'd never seen before, and several of my grandmother.
I really loved how you wove those into the story. I really found those moments, and it really tied different chapters together through those photographs.
As I described it in the book, was exactly how it happened, actually. And the doing of it made such an impression on me, finding the photographs and finding others that were more familiar, and then finding ones that I'd never seen before, had a great impact on me. So that really set me on a path to try and find out what had happened to Rose and her story, because we didn't know anything. And my mother knew very little as well. Just prior to this, I suppose about a year prior to this, I had a good friend who was very interested in ancestry and genealogy, and she looked at my family tree. So I wondered if she could help me get hold of some of the documents, the official documents, that helped to answer some of the questions I had about Rose's life and death. And she managed to get hold of copies of a marriage and a death certificate that really did bring this person out of the shadows. So then really that set me on a path to writing a story, because I knew I had one. So it just went beyond trying to process and experience and unravel what had gone wrong to something a little bit, what I hope would be a little bit more interesting for other people.
Definitely.
Really, it seemed to me that there was something fundamental missing in my mother's early life. And this really had affected her deeply, I felt. And we knew she'd been adopted by a childless aunt and uncle as a very tiny baby, because her birth mother had died. But above and beyond that, we knew nothing. So I was really starting from scratch to pull away the shadows, really, and find.
Right. So you mentioned that you started this back in 2015. Then, so did it take you 4 years to complete this?
I suppose the whole process from typing the first word to getting it out there, yes, 4 years. I wrote part one quite quickly from Dubai. It just kind of poured out of me, but I couldn't do all the historical research that I needed to do from Dubai. So the second half of the book, part two, took much longer to write, and I couldn't really embark on all the research that I needed to do until I returned to the UK in 2017. And I was living in London at the time, and by complete coincidence, I was actually living in a place that was like a 5-minute walk from where all the key events had happened. It was really, I can't explain that, because it was extraordinary. It was like my ancestors were guiding me towards the places I needed to see to tell their story. It was extremely powerful. But having lived in that place, then I could accelerate the writing and complete the historical research I needed to do.
And what was your writing process? Did you have an overall structure when you started? You said that it poured out of you at the beginning. That's one of the I know we struggle with as memoirists is finding that structure that makes sense in the telling and makes it a compelling story. How did that work for you?
Well, the writing process changed a little bit, probably because of the events I've described about my location. When I was writing part one, I won't say I found it easy. I found it very difficult, but I got into a routine because I was very motivated to set down the things that I could remember and to prompt my memory. And I was really focused on doing that. So I sat down every day and wrote, and I didn't have any distractions when I was living overseas. I didn't have a job that I had to go out to every day. So I could really focus on this. And time took on a different meaning, really. my husband told me that he'd leave for work in the morning and I'd be at my desk, and I really wouldn't notice the passing of time until he came back in the evening and he found me in the same position, and quite often still in my dressing gown, right, laptop. And I really, if you ever have moments like that, relish them, because when it came to part 2 and I'd moved back home, I got quite seriously stuck in the middle of part 2. So it didn't carry on that I could just write and it all poured out of me. I got stuck in part 2. But while I was in Dubai, after I'd written about 6 or 8 chapters, I'm sure you all know the feeling. You write this down and you think, is this going to interest anybody else, you know, in the slightest way? Because it's so personal. And that's the challenge we all have as memoirists, isn't it? How is my personal story going to be of remote interest to anyone else? And the only way you really know that is to do some market research. So I joined a writers group in Dubai, and they were all women. They were American ladies. They were completely removed from my culture, from anything that I was writing about. So they were a fantastic audience. And we each had to submit a chapter of what we were working on every fortnight. So I was writing to a deadline. I was writing for readers, really. And we'd each critique each other's work. And it was immensely helpful. Because, as Christina mentioned, I was a journalist, and the journalist has a very different way of approaching a story and writing a story, and they were incredibly helpful to me. And I had so much about story arcs and plot and structure and characters and dialogue, you name it, and I've still got stacks to learn on all those fronts. But they really helped me make my writing better, and they also really gave me an indication that actually this story was interesting to them, and it was well, we want to know what happens next, and the answer to this question and that question. So, you know, and they kept me motivated to carry on.
That's wonderful.
I think
I might have to steal that idea. I really like that idea of submitting a chapter each fortnight and having those critiques. That does sound immensely helpful.
I really would recommend that, because you can see your progress as well, and that's so motivating. You know, when you've been doing this for a while and you type, you know, chapter 10, you think, wow, this is really taking off. This is going somewhere. So, yeah, I found it immensely helpful. I think you know, that the old thing about showing and telling, and they did pull me up a lot on that, because as a journalist, it doesn't really enter your writing, really. You're all about facts when you're a journalist, and it's tell. And so they pulled me up a lot and said, look, just get rid of this journalistic way of writing and start showing and explaining things in a better way, which I did do. But I would actually say, having done this, that I think sometimes the show and tell thing is overstated, because I think you can get away with a bit of telling to push the story forward.
Sure.
I think sometimes you can be, it can be overstated, I think.
I agree.
I take the point.
With your structure, I noticed you did a lot of jumping around the timeline, and which I found worked very well, actually. And I thought that was something that I would like to take away to put towards my writing. I have these little pieces of my story that I think are really interesting, but they don't stand alone. They don't really work as a full chapter. But you did a really nice job of taking those pieces and making them relate to something from a different time period in your life. And I wonder how much of that did you go back in later to add, or did it just come naturally to have those jumps? Because I think it can be confusing if done incorrectly to have a lot of jumps, but it felt like it worked really well in your writing.
Well, I think that might have something to do with my theatre background, to tell you the truth. I instinctively, I did not want to tell the story as it took place in chronological order from beginning to end, because I didn't think that would make for a really interesting reader experience. Somebody described the book, the structure of the book, to me as being like a 3-act drama. And I suppose, you know, I kind of identify with that. How can I describe? Yeah, I wanted to create intrigue. So in part 1, what I wanted the reader to take away by the end of part 1 was some questions in their mind about what had happened before to make this mother like she is. What is it about her past? And I knew my mother's childhood would be the crux of the story, but I didn't want to just spill it all out straight away. I wanted to take the reader with me and to keep the reader turning the pages to find out the answers, I suppose. Was what was leading the structure of it and the time thing. I was concerned about confusing the reader, because while I was writing, I was also reading a lot of books about craft, and particularly memoir. And I did read one that said, whatever you do, don't go back and forth in time. Don't change the point of view, because you will alienate and confuse the reader. And I thought, oh God, I'm committing all these crimes. How will it work? You know, but I haven't had any reader feedback to tell me they were confused by that. And
Not at all.
I think if you make it clear in the writing, I think you can get away with it. And I knew I didn't want to. I started writing part 2 in first person as my mother, and I didn't find. I think I wrote a couple of chapters, you know, as I being my mother, and I thought this is more confusing than being an omniscient narrator. So I decided to change the point of view completely and make it. I thought it made it actually clearer and defined the difference between part 1 and part 2, and then picks up again with me. So yeah, I mean, I suppose as someone with a theatre background, I wanted to create suspense, I wanted to create intrigue, and I wanted tension and a bit of drama, really.
Yes, you did a great job of leaving little teasers at the end of each chapter to keep us wondering what would happen next and to make us want to move on. You mentioned that you read a lot of books about the craft. Do you have one in particular that you would recommend?
Well, I've got what I've got is a list, and I'm very happy to share that as a document, which perhaps, you know, you can look at.
Oh.
Yeah,
that'd be perfect. Great.
More than the writing craft books. Well, I did read. I was very taken with Stephen King's book on writing, which I'm sure you're.
I was too.
Yeah,
Yes.
there's a few other ones, and Sol Stein's books actually spring to mind too. But I can let you have the document that I have, and also some memoirists that made a big impression on me. I think it's always good to read out how someone else has tackled it, you know, with success. So many people are telling your story, and I read some inspirational ones that I thought were well worth sharing with any other writing group. So I'm happy to do that in a document that you can have later.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you. So you mentioned with your journalistic background that you had a lot to learn about the framework, about the story arc and building your characters. So I think you've answered one of our questions was it difficult for you to find that story arc, and how did you settle on that?
Well, as I said, I knew that my mother's backstory would be the crux of it, and that her as a character would follow through from part 1, and how she related to me and how I related to her, through to what happened within her family. Again, do you know, some of these things that you read about, the story arc and the plot and the structure and all that sort of stuff, sometimes I think you can get very focused on it, and it can actually hamper your writing. And sometimes while I was doing it, I was worrying about some of that thing. And I thought to myself, look, I'm just going to put this aside, do the writing, and then think about how it works with the story arc afterwards, because I'm actually being held back here by worrying about this arc and this journey. And I think sometimes if you tell the story well, and you make your characters live in the reader's imagination, the story arc takes care of itself in a way, because you're taking your readers with you. And I mean, I've read other things where the story arc goes nowhere, or the character development kind of plateaus, but it still holds my interest. You know, sometimes I think some of these things are very good theories, but in practice, if you stick too rigidly to them, it can actually hold you back. So I thought, what I'm going to do is write, get the story done, and then see if it all hangs together and makes sense, and communicates what I'm trying to say to a reader.
That gives me hope, because that's what I'm doing.
Yeah, that's the way to go. That's the way to go, definitely.
One of the things that that I've been struggling with is choosing what to keep in and what to leave out. Did you end up with a lot extra that had to be cut out because it didn't fit your story arc, or did you find the opposite?
Well, I had one rule really, and I did stick to the rule. If I was boring myself writing it, and I thought, right, this has got to go, this isn't working. So, you know, either your scene needs to go, or you need to rewrite it to make it work. And I wrote a few scenes that didn't make it into the book because they didn't contribute to the story I was telling. I think it's very easy to let yourself go off at a tangent. And I really had to discipline myself, because there were a lot of characters and a lot of situations that I could have brought in, but were they going to contribute to the actual story that I wanted to tell? And the story I wanted to tell with love and understanding, and that's what I wanted to come through, a fuller understanding. And although some of those other tangents could have been interesting for a bit, they wouldn't have contributed to the whole. Therefore, there was a risk that I could just confuse the reader or take them off into a direction that would dilute everything I was trying to do, everything I was trying to achieve. So I had to be very disciplined. And I think it's even more difficult to be selective when historical research comes into the picture, because there's a danger, I think, with historical research that I felt myself falling into, that you research and you know so much, you think everything you've found out has to be somehow put into the story to make it credible and authentic. And I've read a certain book, there's a certain book that I'm thinking of where I'm trying to be absorbed in the story, but I'm being distracted because the author is insisting on telling me how much research they've done. You can't look at me at how much research I've done. So I really didn't want it to go that way. So although I immersed myself in what I needed to know about the Jewish East End through the 1930s and slightly earlier and beyond, although I immersed myself in all that as much as I could, there was a point where I put it all to one side, and what came through in the writing was just the small details that would signify time and place, without really going into the huge background. Because the other thing I really feel about historical research is when you've got characters from that time talking in their own homes, in their own environment, in their own world, they're not necessarily always talking about these massive world events that are happening. Although they obviously affect them, it's not always the topic of discussion within families. It's survival. It's about the relationships they've got with each other and the difficulties they're having to, you know, put food on the table and get along with each other. So I took it from that point of view. So I did speak to a group of historians last week, and nobody voiced any dissatisfaction with the historical detail that was or wasn't there. So I'm reasonably happy with that.
Yeah. So that leads right into another question we had about how you went about researching and writing those events that happened before your birth, and you really took pains to make those characters come alive when you'd never known them yourself. And so obviously there had to be some level of, you know, fabrication. We all have to do that. Everyone knows with a memoir you can't possibly, even if it is solely about yourself, it's impossible to recreate conversations. And so if you could just speak to that process and what your research was and how you went about recreating this time that was before you were even born.
Right. Well, I had a journal that my mother left behind, which was a very brief expose of what she knew about her early life and her childhood. And she didn't know anything about her mother because for various reasons which become clear in the book, Rose, her mother, was really airbrushed out of history. So as I mentioned before about the copies of the official documents that I found very helpful, I was looking at a marriage certificate and a death certificate. So from those documents, I then had addresses, I had an occupation, I had an age, I had a place of death, and I had a cause of death. I also found out that this really broke my heart, that Rose was married on the 21st of July, 1929, and 10 months later she was dead. So she only had 10 months of happiness with her husband, which to me is heartbreaking. And then when I looked at the age of her husband when she died, and in the same week, her husband became a father, a new father, and a widower, and he was 24. So I have two sons who are in their 30s now. I remember very well what they were like when they were 24. And it just, that to me, really helped me get into the head of the tragedy, really, that must have occurred for that young man. And although I'm very sympathetic to him at that point, there were various events after that in which he made some very poor choices. But at that moment, I wanted the sympathy to be with him. And without seeing those documents, I wouldn't have been able to get inside, really, the crux of the tragedy. It was very meaningful, really. Sorry, I've lost the thread of your question originally.
I think that you've done a nice job of answering that regarding what research you went to and how you got into that that spirit of how tragic it was for the characters, and having children of similar age helped you imagine what it would have been like.
There was another element to it as well, that looking at those documents, I had a clear path to the other research that I needed to do to fill out the kind of world that they were living in. So I found out that my grandmother was a cigarette maker in the East End of London. So I had some research to do on cigarette production. My grandfather was said to be a racecourse tipster at the time of his marriage. So I had some research to do on racecourses. Of course, childbirth in the Jewish East End in the late 1920s. The geography of the area associated with my relatives and the location of graves and maps showing the actual addresses where they lived. So that was a whole chunk of research that I did. I could consult, which I did, academics, medical historians, midwives, hospital archivists, and blue badge guides. We have a system in the UK of blue badge guides who are experts in showing in certain areas of London, and they do tours. So I did a one-to-one tour with a blue badge guide in that specific area of London, so she could really fill in a lot of information about the world that my ancestors grew up in. But a turning point for me really came when I looked at some obstetric patient records from the year 1930. I was very fortunate to be able to do that at the archive of Bart's NHS Trust. And I don't know if any of you have heard of the series called Call the Midwife in the UK, very, very popular series. It's the same research archive that the writers on that programme use. And this was fascinating because I could see the treatments and the outcomes for women who had the same condition as my grandmother. Mm-hmm. And I could see, you know, what happened to them. Some survived, some didn't. There were 11 women treated at that hospital in 1930 with the same condition, and 3 died. One was almost a carbon copy of my grandmother's case. And I think the most telling thing was, in my naivety, I asked the archivist why, when I looked at a page of writing, beautiful copperplate writing, you can imagine matron filling in all the details, why were some entries written in red ink? And they said, oh, well, if you read along the columns, those are the fatalities. Those are the ones that didn't go home. And that really, well, I just welled up because I could see that there was some red ink entries and everyone was a book. Yeah. And I was just writing one. So there was one fortunate thing for me that, which I'll explain. The documents that I received showed that my grandmother died in a hospital very far away from her home. And I knew my mother had been born at home. And this remains a mystery. And I consulted a lot of experts. Why, in her emergency condition, would she have been taken to a hospital on the other side of London when there were hospitals on her doorstep? And this remains a mystery because the hospital where she actually died, none of the patient records remain. They were all destroyed in a fire. So that would have answered my question. But in fact, it's controversial. And the journey across London may have even contributed to her death. We don't know. Maybe the hospitals on her doorstep were full. Maybe she was already seeing a consultant in this other hospital and he insisted she be brought to him. Who knows? It remains a mystery. But I was very grateful, really, that I couldn't see the actual documents from the hospital where she died, because I think it would have been very, very painful to see my grandmother's name written in red ink as a fatality. And I'm glad I didn't have to do that. So that was one saving grace.
So while you were writing this, did the process make you aware of history repeating itself? I know we definitely picked up on some of that when we were reading it. Or did it bring to light any aspects about yourself or your mother that were previously unknown to you?
Well, inheritance is a theme that runs through the book. When I started putting the story together, I soon realized there was a recurring pattern of human behavior through the generations, which hadn't occurred to me so obviously before. It made me think about what we inherit from our ancestors, you know, in terms of material things, perhaps, but also maybe also our weaknesses, our flaws, our mistakes, our skills, our talents too. I found it an interesting thing to think about because the cast of characters does have a repeating theme, which I'm sure you've picked up. We've got several assertive and controlling women, a succession of weak men, a couple of heroic husbands, and 2 monstrous stepmothers. So yes, I think history repeated itself in a very unfortunate way, but I think because I've got two sons, I'd like to think that I've broken the spell on dysfunctional mother and daughter relationships. That's the way I see it anyway. But the writings helped me make peace with the past, really.
Yeah.
And given my grandmother a longer life than she was allowed on earth, really. So
that's a wonderful way to look at that.
There's a lighter note, actually, that there was a discovery that I can share with you on a lighter note. We now have confirmation that my mother lied about her age. She always took 5 years off her age. Actually left instructions in her will that her gravestone was to say that she was born in 1935. And I know that she was born in 1930. I've seen the documents and I've written the story. I think she'd be furious.
That brings us, that's hilarious. That does bring us to one of our questions, but were there relatives that asked to be excluded from your story, and did you have to remove some people later? And then how did your family react to the story?
Right. Well, I changed a few names. In the book, the two stepmothers, their names are slightly changed. One of them, her daughters and grandchildren are still living, and I felt it was perhaps the right thing to do, not to print her name, but she's hugely recognizable. You can't libel the dead anyway, but it felt right that I should disguise her name. The other stepmother, I couldn't bring myself personally to write her actual name, so I decided to change her name because I still have very deep feelings about her, so I didn't want to write her real name. There's some school friends that I've mentioned. One in particular, I used her real name and I gave her the extract to read before publication because I wanted to see if she was happy with it, and she was, and I think she was hugely flattered, especially when I invited her to the book launch. So that went well. There was one school friend, I changed her name for comic effect, but it wasn't so very far away from the reality. If any of you remember reading about Twixie, who couldn't.
I thought that was who you were going to speak about.
She couldn't say her R's, but her actual name was Trudy, so not so very far away from the truth. And there's an effect, but I quite like the sound of Twixie, so I changed that. Regarding what my family thought about the book, well, I was taking a chance, wasn't I? And I think this is something of a challenge for all of us, really. What will our friends and family think? And I read lots of advice that said, look, don't worry about that, just do the writing and sort that out later, or don't be inhibited by what you think people will say or what they will think, because you could be wrong. And I was slightly nervous about my brother reading the book. There's 9 years between us, and he is mentioned in the book, but I very deliberately didn't want to give him dialogue. I didn't want to put words in his mouth, because this is my truth. It might not be his truth. And he had a very different experience to me, and he might not agree with everything I said. So for that reason, I wanted him there, but I didn't want to sort of make him a rounded person. And I was nervous when he read the book, but his response was extraordinary. He said, you've got it spot on. And it was a revelation to me, because we've never really discussed in detail how we felt about our growing up and, you know, about our mum and all the rest of it. So that was very comforting to me. And his wife, my sister-in-law, knew my mum personally, had many of the same similar experiences as I had, and she's been very supportive. Writing the book has put me in touch with 3 relatives, which I wasn't really in touch with before. Two of them I didn't know at all. There's a very minor character called Golda in the book, who she's Becky's sister, and she actually died at a very young age of breast cancer. But her daughter, Sylvia, who's also called Sylvia, is she's in her 70s, and she loves the book. She's passed it to so many friends of hers, saying, "This is about my family, you've got to read it." So she enjoyed it hugely. Another relative, a distant relative, contacted me after seeing a post on Facebook that I'd written, asking if anyone remembered this address and the people that lived there, and their name was Dihan. And she responded to this Facebook post that I put on and said, "My family's name is Dihan. Do you think it could be related?" Anyway, we corresponded, and we are related distantly. And she's delighted to find out a little more about her family than she knew. This is very telling, actually, because this relative told me that Boy and Eva actually attended her wedding. And before she read my book, she had absolutely no idea that Boy had been married before. So that kind of shows how Rose was airbrushed out of the family story, which was very interesting to me. Just a couple of months ago, I had an article published in a national newspaper. And following that, I was contacted by a gentleman in his 90s called Leslie. And his mum was Rose's sister. And Rose's sister, they were very close. Rose's sister died 2 years after Rose of TB. And that may have been brought on by the heartbreak she felt about losing her younger sister. So Leslie, her son in his 90s, contacted me, and it was lovely to talk to him. We've had a long Skype conversation. After his mum died, his father remarried, and there's another very sad tale of an awful stepmother. I think he'd love me to read that too, but whoa. I think I'm done with that. But it was lovely to talk to him, and he said he read the book and said, "This is my life. This is my family. This is my story too." So that was very nice endorsement, really.
Wonderful. Now, could you tell us a little bit about the publishing process? Did you go to a small press, or did you self-publish? How did you make that decision?
Well, I made that decision, and I hope this inspires all of you out there, whether you have a publisher or not. While I was writing the story, I was thinking about, what am I going to do? Am I going to seek permission from a third party before I put this story out there? Or am I just going to self-publish, get it out there, make my own efforts at marketing and talking to readers and doing it that way? And because I said I'm a journalist, but I'm also a PR consultant, so I've got some experience in marketing and promoting stuff. And I thought, first of all, I don't want to seek permission, because I was in the writers group in Dubai. There were several people doing just that. They were writing all these querying letters and, writing to publishers and thinking, is my story good enough? How can I make my query letters stand out from the crowd? And they were tying themselves in knots over it. And I thought to myself, traditional publishers, more than ever, are looking for books that are going to make huge amounts of money very fast. Do I really want to kind of put myself up against that and have rejection after rejection? No, I don't. I think this story is interesting. I'd like to see what my own efforts could bring. I'm going to get it out there myself. So with my husband's help, he's my publisher, really. He's Ingle Book Publishing. We kind of made it a family project. If you've looked at the book on Amazon or Kindle, you would have seen the front cover here, and possibly, I'm not sure if you've seen the back cover, but anyway, the cover designer are the photographs I found, and a photograph I took of an East End background. My son is an artist, and he put the covers together and designed the font on the front and back and everything. So it was kind of a family project. And it was fun. It was much more fun than handing it to a third party. Even if the publisher had said, yes, we love it, here we go. I've seen what happens with traditional publishers, and they're very enthusiastic. If they take your book, they're very enthusiastic for that initial spurt of marketing. But if they don't get the results they seek very fast, they're on to the next project, or they're saying, where's your next book? And I was doing some events with another author when I launched this. I was doing some events with another author who traditionally published. And she just churns them out because her publisher, that's what her publisher demands. And I could see the journey of the marketing and the effort they put in was very, very short-lived on each book. Now, I published this a year ago, and I'm still getting opportunities to talk to readers, to write articles for specialist magazines or specialist blogs or whatever, a year later. And it's everything that I've achieved is through my own efforts. And it's way more than I think a traditional publisher would bother with. So for me, it's been a really fun journey. And writing the book was a fantastic achievement. It's a fantastic achievement for anybody to complete a project like that. But to get it out there and then use your own efforts extends the satisfaction. And I don't think I'd ever do it any other way. In fact, I am writing a second book, and there's things I've learned that I will do differently.
That leads us to our last question, was if you were to do it all over again, is there anything in the process you would change?
Well, for Where Are the Grown-Ups, I think two things I'd do differently. I would actually include a graphic of the family tree highlighting all the different people, because I've had a couple of readers say they had to go sort of look back a bit and find out, just check that they got the right person in the right place. So I think I would definitely do that. And in the next edition, I will add a family tree graphic. I would also, and I was advised to do this, but I didn't listen. My Dubai writers group advised me, read your work out loud. Read it out loud, because then you realise the clumsy expressions, the typos and all the rest of it. And I didn't pay attention to that, but I've just finished recording the audio because I'm narrating the audio book. So that's another part of the project that's taken me further on. I've just finished doing the narration, and I realise now, because I've actually read the whole book out loud, what wise advice that is. Because boy, you know, some of my sentences are a bit long, and when you're trying to, even with drama training, it's not that easy. So with the second book, I'm definitely going to actually record the audio before it's gone to print, definitely, because I just think it's so helpful in every way. So those are definitely the things that I would pass on and do differently.
Is your next book going to be another memoir, or is it fiction?
It is another memoir. It's a very different memoir. It's a travel and food writing memoir. When I was a full-time journalist, I did quite a bit of travel writing and food writing especially. And I thought, it prompted by the lockdown and everything that's gone on since March, travel and eating out were the two things that I took great pleasure in doing, that were cut off to me. You know, that was it. You can't do those things anymore. And to a lot of other people. So I thought it's a good premise, a good way to perhaps frame another memoir. And so I've looked back at a lot of the experiences I had in Dubai, a lot of travel experiences. It's such a major hub that everyone who lands in Dubai uses that opportunity to travel to places that we wouldn't normally have access to from that place. So I had a lot of travel writing and food experiences that I thought would make a good memoir if I could pull them together in the context of our present crisis. Because who knows if those things are coming back again in the way that they once did. So it's nostalgic, really.
We're really interested in hearing what took you to Australia and to Dubai. So I hope that you include some of that in your next memoir.
Definitely. In fact, we got back from a sentimental journey to South Australia just before the lockdown. So I did actually revisit some friends and places very recently. So that will find its way in there, yeah, definitely, for sure.
Wonderful. So now, if you don't mind, I think if we could open the floor to anyone that has any questions in our audience.
I'll go. Hi, Ruth.
Hi. Hi.
So good to finally see you after chatting with you online for so long. If someone was just starting a memoir, or say they have an idea in their head for wanting to start a memoir, but they're very intimidated, what advice would you give them in order to get that process started? Or what are the first steps that they can take to prepare themselves to start writing a memoir?
I think they have to want to be able to. They have to want to tell the story. Their intimidation can't be so overwhelming. You know, they must have a desire within them to kind of break through that. So, what helped me a lot, because I was treading in some quite sensitive areas, really, and you know, there were many times when I sat at my keyboard in tears, not sure if I could actually put this down in the way that I wanted to. And I think one of the things that helped ground me in the situations that I was struggling with was to think in my head, walk through in my head my childhood home. Those were the areas of difficulty that I was struggling with writing emotionally. So in my head, I walked through my childhood home and I tried to visualize the rooms, the layout, the objects, you know, the textures, the way the furniture. And some of those things acted as writing prompts and memory prompts. But they also, in a way, distracted me from the distress, because I had to focus on those real things and frame them in a way that made sense in my story. And I found that very helpful, actually. And it sounds a small thing to do, but it is kind of a way of distracting yourself away from the emotion to think about those actual physical things in the actual world of your head rather than the emotions. So I hope that's one help. The other thing to do is to just spit it out on the page, because editing is a wonderful thing. And if you're intimidated, it's often best to get out onto the page or the computer screen what it is that's intimidating you. It doesn't have to find its way into the final version, but it could be a big relief to you to actually get it out there for yourself. You don't have to share it. It's up to you. So I hope
good advice. Yeah, it's definitely helpful. Thank you.
So you stop. At what point would you say one should stop editing? I mean, because one stage is bringing out the story, even if it's emotional and heavy. And like, I'm also working on a multi-generational memoir, and there are times when if something is happening in my family at the moment, it's too heavy and I cannot focus on the heavy writing about other heavy parts of our lives. But then at some point you want to edit, you want to polish the craft, but you also want to preserve some of the raw emotions that you were trying to transmit in the first place. I find this more challenging with memoir than with fiction. So what advice would you have on like balancing these two? You already touched upon the lengths of sentences and listening to yourself read the text. But I'm just wondering, I'm always afraid that I'm going to over edit something in the need to make it perfect and lose some of that raw emotion that was there in the beginning.
Okay, well, importantly, don't get rid of all the drafts that you're improving. Or, you know, there's cut and paste is fantastic, you know, because I remember taking out great sections, but actually storing it somewhere in case I needed it, you know, date, or I wanted to put it back in. So, you know, I think the most helpful thing really is to, hard as it may be, not to give it to your close relatives, but actually to give it to someone else to look at. And that's where I think sharing these things within a supportive writing environment is so helpful, because I think those are the people that really can say to you, I don't think this bit is working quite well, but maybe if you changed it in this way, or we looked at it from a different perspective, that might be better. I sometimes think that if you're so focused on your editing process yourself without getting any feedback, it becomes very hard. And I think you can over edit, although it's obviously very important. I think it's really helpful to get another pair of eyes on it. If you've lived with it for a long time and you're getting stuck, the other thing that I did was to leave it and go back to it. You know, you can concentrate and focus for so long, but if you're getting stuck or it's not progressing, it's actually better to leave it, do another part or do another piece, come back to it with a fresh eye another day. It's quite a good habit actually, when I was living overseas, of writing one day, just writing, and then the next morning I'd wake up and my day would start by reviewing what I'd written the previous day. And that was really helpful, because it stood out to me what was working and what wasn't, because I'd had that slip between the two, to refocus and have a more balanced view of what I'd written. So that those things might help. Does that sound helpful? I hope so. Good luck.
Thanks.
How many drafts of your memoir did you have, Ruth?
Yes, I had 3 or 4. It wasn't the whole thing wasn't 3 or 4 drafts, but there were some parts that were redrafted 3 or 4 times, and maybe I should have had more drafts. I think you can carry on ad infinitum on the editing front. I really do, but there comes a point when you think, well, I know I did. There came to a point I thought, this is the best. I can't do it any better than I've done it at this point in time, and I'm limited by my capabilities right now, and it's my first book, and I'm not going to be that hard on myself to keep looking for perfection, which might not exist. I have to trust myself that it's good enough. And I think, of course, we're all striving to do the best we can, but sometimes I think it's good enough, because God knows I've read some traditionally published books that really I think, how, why did this get out there, and why is it a success? So, you know, bear those in mind.
Yeah, I think that it's very important to realize that good enough is better than not ever.
Yeah,
I know that I get stuck in the perfectionist trap, and sometimes get paralyzed by that. And so I think that is very good advice to realize that, yeah, you want to do the best you can within reason. It is important to just get it out there.
Yeah, and everything you do is a learning process, you know.
Definitely.
And it's, you know, your first book is never going to be your best book, maybe, or maybe it will be. I don't know. Yeah. Hey, would your first book be your best book? It could be. You're like,
It could be.
I don't think I could feel as passionately about a project as I felt about this, actually. I just lived it and breathed it for the years I was writing it, dreamed it. I mean, I don't know if any of you get that involved in what I hope you do, because you know you're onto something if it just won't leave you alone. And, you know, I know you hear this cliche about writers getting up in the middle of the night and writing things down. I never did that, by the way, but I did dream scenes, and then I'd wake up and write them as I dreamt them, and that worked. I quite often dream solutions, and then I reenact the solution when I get up. So, you know, I hope that works for people sometimes. But if you're passionate about something and it won't leave you alone, that's kind of good, really. That's how it should be.
Yes, definitely. All right, does anyone else? Looks like Amy, you have a question?
Yeah, I don't have a question per se. I just wanted to say that it was inspiring for me when you mentioned getting into the age of your ancestors and imagining how they were at that age, because part of my memoir is about my grandfather, and I haven't thought about that yet. Like, I've always seen it from his perspective, but in my head it's always his, you know, age when I knew him as a child, not as he was as a child. So it was inspiring to think of family members in the way that you would think of a character. So I just wanted to say thank you for that.
Oh, no, pleasure. Yeah. Well, I think I had a good subject with Boy, because his whole history as a person, you know, his personal story was just heartrending, though not unique by any means in that time and in that place. But so many things that impacted on him and how he would cope with situations through his life. You know, I have good material to work with there. So I hope your grandfather gives you as good and rich texture as that.
Yeah, definitely.
Good. Hi.
Hi. Thanks. I just wanted to say thank you for sharing about how you found yourself physically close to where your ancestors had lived. And I just wanted to share with you, the memoir I'm working on is not about these ancestors of mine, but I lived in London a number of years ago. I knew that I was from Londoners. I was descended from Londoners on my mother's side. But it was only a few years ago that I discovered that all the places that I kept going back to and that were my favorite haunts, and actually some of the places were very near where I lived, they were all places where my ancestors had been married, baptized, died. I even though I lived there for a year, those were the spots that intuitively I kept seeking out, and I didn't know about the connection to those spots until about a year ago. So I just wanted to share that with you, and thank you for sharing that aspect. And just thank you for your book. It's wonderful. I do have one quick question, if I can.
Yeah.
And it was great to hear you say about, you know, the boring spots that you've just sort of chucked. If you find them boring, you chucked them. Did you find that there were some boring spots, though, that as you worked on them, they improved and you could turn them around, or if they were pedantic, that they just kind of stayed pedantic overall?
I just think I got to a point where I thought, this isn't really pushing the story forward. You know, it's, you know, a mildly interesting interlude, but it's not really serving the bigger story that I'm trying to tell here. So let's just, you know, cut. And I suppose I was quite ruthless because I've been in journalism. I'm quite used to kind of cutting things, and because you have to write to space. So if it's too long, it's got to, you know, you've got to hack it, really. So I suppose that I didn't stress too much when things had to go. I was trying to look at the bigger picture. What you say about the being drawn to places, if you've read the book, you'll know that there's and people who haven't, this is a bit of a spoiler, but don't worry about it. You'll know that there's a spiritual element to this, in the sense of, I felt very, very powerfully that my ancestors were, you know, drawing me to the places I needed to see. And my mother was a great believer in the spirit world. So I knew, I just absolutely knew that after she died, I would have to try and communicate with a medium to see if there was some kind of way of, I don't know, finding some resolution, I suppose, between us from the other side. Now, for those of you who think this is a load of baloney, just park that for a moment. So I went to see two mediums actually, and what the exchange in the book about that is actually an amalgamation of both of those visits.
Mm-hmm.
So on the first visit, it was at the time that I'd cleared my mother's possessions from the house. So my mother had only been dead about 6 months, and I sought out a medium because I knew that we kind of had a pact that, you know, she'd try and communicate with me. So I went to see a medium who was remarkable, and she told me there was a message from my mother, and my mother was trying to tell, amongst other things, my mother was trying to tell me that she knows she didn't do everything right, which is a very important message that I received at that time, I felt. And she also told me that she could see me living in the countryside, which I thought was a load of nonsense at the time. I was living in Dubai. I knew I wouldn't be living there forever, but we didn't know where we were going to be after that. But the countryside, I'm a city person, so I thought, yeah. So I kind of parked that, and when I eventually returned to the UK, first of all lived in the area of London that I mentioned before. We sought to put down roots permanently in this country, and well, I'm living in the countryside, but I didn't design that. It just, a series of coincidences happened. We saw a house, and it happened to be, the house chose us. That's how I feel. We walked through the house and it chose us, and it happens to be pretty rural. So she was right. Anyway, I hadn't been here more than a couple of weeks, and I'd just about finished the book. And in our small nearest town, it's a very small nearest town, country town. Every time I went into that town, I passed a street with a notice board on the pavement advertising site things, and I almost, you know, tripped over this every time I went past this building, and I thought, this is bizarre. Out of everything in this town, this is the thing that is here. It's a very weird thing. So anyway, I booked an appointment and went in, and this lady was remarkable, and she told me that she could see my mother and a much younger woman standing next to her, and on the table there was a book, which I didn't put in the book, but she said on the table there's some flowers, and I believe they're trying to tell me that the flowers are not flowers, but they're somebody's name. And I just held my breath, and she said, Rose. And well, you know, so I put all of that into the one thing at the end of the book. After that happened, actually, I had to sit in the car for about an hour. I was, you know, complete mess and sobbing and everything. So when you say your ancestors you had that feeling too, that you were being drawn, I just do believe it. I think it was a very real experience for me. And I go back often, and I need to go back often, and I can't really explain why. Because certainly when I was growing up, that particular area of London was a no-go zone. Yeah. The East End of London was just, there was nothing there except poverty. You just did not go there. You went to the West End and had your fun there. But of course, the East End has changed. But what it was before there are so many clues and sort of landmarks that are still there, that have been preserved, and all the history is very well documented. So you don't have to look very far to find history and find evidence of what once was. So it's still a place that I go to a lot, and I get I was there last week. It just feeds my soul.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I completely understand. And thank you so much for elucidating. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? I think maybe that's it. So again, Ruth, we very much enjoyed.
Could I ask
Yes.
a question?
Sure, please.
In the first part, for people who read it, do you think I was fair on my mum? Was there a point when you thought, not sure about how fair this is? Do you think it was
Not at all. I mean, I never thought that it would be unfair towards a mother.
I'll give you some feedback. I worked with an editor towards the end, and he was very far removed from the culture and the attitudes that I was writing about. And he said that he didn't think in part 3 I was tough enough on my mother. He thought I was too soft on my mother, and he said, "You've let her get away with everything, and you've soft spoken it all, you've whitewashed it all by the end." And I don't know if you agree with this, but my response to that was, "But love is complicated. It's not black and white. It's many shades, isn't it? As we all know." So I just wanted to know whether you shared that view or not. But I felt that it was true to what I wanted to say, because I did want it to be written with some sense of understanding and some learning and some growth on my part of understanding, because I wasn't very generous to or understanding to my mother in life, but I kind of get it more now. Now I've investigated and reflected on her background. So I don't see it as soft soaping at all, but just loving.
No, I saw it as very, very much growth. So, like, I didn't think you were unfair to your mother in the first part, but I saw more of the why in the second part. And then I saw more of your why in the third part.
Oh,
so
cool.
It definitely did build on itself as you went through the story. And I never felt like, wow, this is a person I don't want to know. Like, I think you were generous to her, but you did give us that building story, definitely.
Right, thank you. Thanks.
I just love to say that, no, I think in reading how you wrote about her, I appreciated the complexity of it, because my mother and I were actually very fiercely close, but we had a very complex relationship. And I just found when you were writing, it just made sense. I think mother-daughter relationships are complex, whether you're close or you're not close, or they're very rich in texture. And I thought that you actually achieved that. And that's one of the things that I liked. I looked at this and said, oh, yes, this is real. This is very real. And what you were saying about now that your mother's gone and you've gone through this process, that you're closer to her. I had a spiritual director, an Episcopalian or, Anglican priest, and she said that she got along much better with her mother after her mother died. and she told me that within 6 months of my own mother's death, and I said, "Oh, yes." You know, so I don't know. I just wanted to throw that in, but no, I appreciated that you weren't glossing over things, and I do find that sometimes some men find it difficult to comprehend the many layers of relationships between mothers and daughters. You know, it can be tricky to understand, I think. So,
well, maybe we ought to hear from the gentlemen in the audience or what they think.
Well, I think actually in our book club for this particular book, we only had women. So,
okay. I know my husband used to stand back in amazement and witness some of the exchanges between my mum and me. But you know, he began to understand it, but I think he found it shocking at first until he got used to it. The other thing I just wanted to check in with you, because and people are readers that really often give me the feedback that they're so taken with the tragic side of the story. I just wondered if any of you found any of it humorous, because I did try and inject some humor. It's rare, but it's there. I just wondered if that went over anybody's head, or whether I succeeded in that. I can give you a couple of examples. You all got the idea that my mother was an obsessive cleaner.
yes.
Tidier. Everything had to be pristine. And there was a situation which I described in the book where I was a teenager, and I'm kind of ambushed in my own home when some friends come round and they start interfering with the sacred kitchen cupboards, which must not be interfered with. And rapidly, my kitchen is becoming a crime scene, and it's going to be up to me to restore everything to perfection. And of course, I fail miserably. And I tried to write that with some humour in it. And I just wondered, and there were other moments when, you know, I'm out shopping with my mother and she's forcing me to wear these awful clothes that are not of my...
That orange coat, wasn't
the
it?
orange coat, yeah, the orange coat, yeah, famous. You know, things she'd pick for herself, but not, you know, for me. So I did try and write things with humour to kind of give some light and shade, really.
Yeah, I would say that I would never have described it as a humorous book, but there were humorous elements. It was very, very real. I mean, there are definitely moments like these that you've just described that are humorous, and I was cringing along with you when you were describing your friends going through the kitchen, and you're like, oh, trying to be cool, but also kind of screaming inside because you knew your mother was not going to approve and that you were going to be found out, and so it felt really real. Definitely did feel your humor and just felt your pain as well. And it wasn't, one of the things I did like about your story is that though there are a number of things that are tragic about it, it never feels depressing or self-pitying. It's real without being overly emotional in a bad way.
Right, okay, thank you, that's good feedback. I'm still seeking feedback, you can tell. Really, no, it's really helpful, actually. And I will happy to do the same for anybody here. But if you have read it and you've enjoyed it and you feel like putting something on Amazon or Goodreads that would help other readers, I'd really appreciate that. That would be brilliant. So thanks if you do.
Yes, I guess I haven't.
Is anyone here close to finishing a book or about to publish, or are you still in the writing stages?
I think Deanna is.
Oh, okay.
Deanna, would you like to speak to that at all, or she's on mute still? So.
Okay.
I have a lot of words written, but I'm having a hard time bringing it to a point where I can call it a draft and taking it to that next step. That's where I am. We have people at all different steps of the way here.
Okay, cool.
All right. Well, I guess I had one more question for you. I was wondering, so have you been pleased with their sales and with the marketing that you've done? Is there anything you'd like to share on that piece before we go?
Well, I haven't been doing any paid advertising, and I know there's whole courses you can do, and you can spend a whole lot of money on learning how to put ads on Facebook and Amazon. Do you know what? That leaves me absolutely cold. I'm sure that there is some magic to getting amazing sales figures, but you have really got to spend a lot of money to do that, and nothing's guaranteed. As I said before, I found it so much more interesting to seek out my own opportunities, to talk to groups like you. I've spoken to other writers groups, family history societies, genealogical research groups, and book clubs, and I've created those opportunities myself, and it's just been so much more satisfying to me than placing an ad. If you're looking to make a living out of your one book, I think it's very, very hard as a self-published writer. So, you know, any sales I have, to me, are an absolute thrill and a bonus. You know, it's not big bucks, it's not big money by any means. It gives me a thrill. Whatever the sales are each month, it gives me a thrill and a buzz. And I know, really, when I look at the really successful people like Mark Dawson or whatever, I don't know how they do it, but they're churning out books like constantly. And the one thing I struggle with that is when you write a book, you're not necessarily thinking about, especially a memoir, you're not thinking about a series, and it's a series that makes all this money. And I don't think like that, and I'm not that kind of writer. So I suppose I'm accept the fact that I'm not going to, make a living at this. But that's not really why I started doing it.
I'm sure it's a reward in itself. I know that the process for me has been very rewarding, and you've alluded to that as well. Yeah. And contrary to what you just said, you are writing a second one, so it does sound like you are writing a series. I think 2 qualifies as a series.
Well, I think 2 qualifies as a series. I'll take that. Yeah. I think if you can get your book in sort of paperback and Kindle and audio formats, then you've got like 3 ways of earning money, and 3 options for readers, however they consume their books. You're covering all the bases there, which I think is a good thing, good sensible thing to do. So if you can do that with each book, then eventually it's going to be a growth process. But I certainly couldn't churn them out. I want it to be of quality, really. There must be some kind of formula that these people follow that churn out these series. I'm not sure whether I'm that kind of writer, and I don't really aspire to be, because I don't think that would be very satisfying personally to me.
Yes.
So sorry about that I can't kind of say, that you're going to make a whole heap of money. But there's more to it that you definitely need another job. But then you haven't got enough time, have you? If you've got a very demanding other job. I really admire people who've got very demanding jobs and children, because I did have the luxury of some time and some space to really get stuck in, and to really find that I had a chunk done, which is a big motivator. Once you've got so far in, you can see the end point.
Yes.
I still have one very quick last question. Even though you've made the decision to self-publish, did you nonetheless write a book proposal for yourself as a sort of check-in method?
Well, do you know what? As part of my marketing, I was contacting media a lot. I was contacting magazines, newspapers, radio broadcasters. So I had to have a really snappy, good press release.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the equivalent of a book proposal, really, because people in the media, they'll read the first couple of paragraphs, and if it doesn't grab them, then they're the next thing, it's in the bin. So I think, I could write a book proposal, but I just happened to write it in a press release form, I suppose.
And it sounds like you had a good idea of your target audience, or types of audience, primary audience, and you gave some really great examples of readership you were aiming to, which I think is a challenge sometimes for memoir, unless it's a self-help book, or I don't know, a women's journey to liberation. So I feel like with some themes for memoir, it's not so easy to define your audience.
No, even for fiction, actually, it's not so easy too. You need a hook. You need a hook that kind of leads you to where your readers might be and the interest groups that your readers might be involved with. And I suppose anything to do with family history and ancestry and times past and historical tragedies opens a few doors, to obvious places that are going to be of interest. Being PR, you have to kind of look at where those hooks may be. So I would have to look at your story to kind of suggest areas that you could perhaps think about approaching. To me, that's the fun side, finding these. I'm still finding them, I'm still finding them. It's certainly possible, but you just sometimes you have to have lateral thinking, and certainly I didn't realize actually till I started looking how many Facebook groups of special interest there are around, and kind of hook into that audience. That can be very, very helpful and very powerful, actually, because they spread the word. And it wasn't until I started looking that I had any idea of where they were on Twitter too. Lots of possibilities to explore on social media. Definitely, that's certainly a big help for self-published writers. Plus, if you join the Alliance of Independent Authors who are based in the UK, you get a whole lot of really useful information about marketing, promotion, all manner of things to do with self-publishing. It's a really useful organisation with lots of expert advice to answer questions on all sorts of areas. That might be something to consider. Definitely.
I think Laura has a question.
It's not really a question. I just wanted to tell you that unfortunately I have yet to read your book, but after listening to you, I can't wait to read it. And I have to say, listening to you, it really inspired me today, because I've been writing my memoir for 5 years, and 4 years I've been living it. For 4 years I've been living the part of the memoir. So it's scattered through 20 different notebooks and Word documents on my computer. And just listening to you is really giving me a lot of good ideas as far as format is concerned, and really inspired me to keep going.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah, I really wanted you to know that.
Thank you, Laura. That's fantastic. Great. I hope you've got a really good story. You're going to tell me.
She does have a really good story. Everyone here does.
Thank you. You've also inspired me to call my mother tonight. So.
Oh,
wow. Excellent. God, this is powerful, this stuff.
Isn't it? Oh, yes, this is such a wonderful group, and it's just been so wonderful having you here, Ruth. You've answered so many of our questions with some really helpful and insightful answers. And we very much enjoyed your book and very much enjoyed the opportunity to talk with you. And thank you so much for taking the time. And
Wow,
we're looking forward to your next book and your continued success.
Thank you very much. I'd like to stay in touch and tell you when the next one's out, and keep writing.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.